Following the events involving policing and racial justice across the United States last summer, you asked me to form a group that would review police policies and practices. And while the Arlington County Police Department continues to embrace a quality, positive approach to policing, the group, which became known as the Police Practices Group, PPG, was asked to review department practices in certain areas. So the goal of the group was to build upon our current best practices and suggest ways for our police and community to work on something we're calling next practices. So we should have some slides up here. I'm going to ask, thank you, Bryna. If we could go to the next slide, which shows you these are the members of the PPG. There were 15 members that I selected, and you can see their names there, along with, we had 3 ex officio members. And we go on to the next slide. The 15-member police practices group first met in July, and they divided into 4 subcommittees. And you can see the 4 subcommittees here focused on 4 key issues. The first one, the type and approach for a civilian review board. Secondly, the role of our police department in responding to behavioral health crises. Third, our role of our police department in traffic enforcement. And finally, an opportunity for alternative dispute resolution, including restorative justice and mediation. So the PPG reviewed literature and gathered online feedback from hundreds of county residents. Collectively, the subcommittees held over 60 sessions, which included hosting focus groups with community members, hosting community learning sessions with subject matter experts, and having deliberative committee meetings to discuss what they learned. And that took place mostly from August of 2020 through February of 2021. So the PPG provided over 100 recommendations to me, which included immediate, short-term, and long-term actions. And I'd like to acknowledge that the work of the PPG is going to take a while to realize. So before I go over the specific recommendations of the PPG, I wanted to, as you had asked, brief you and the community on the steps we've taken beginning in 2020 while the PPG work was underway to improve our approach to issues related to criminal justice. So we can go to the next slide. You'll see here is a list of some of the things that we implemented starting last spring. We've added the police now have an online reporting function in Spanish. Due to the action of the General Assembly and the governor, in July of this past year, we began implementation of the Community Policing Act. And you can see that that act prohibits law enforcement officers from engaging in bias-based policing. And specifically, the data collection that is required under that act for traffic stops includes gathering information based on race, ethnicity, age, and gender, reason for the stop, whether it was a verbal warning, a written citation, or summons, and whether any person was arrested for a violation. It also requires documentation of whether the vehicle was searched. And a lot of what was in the Community Policing Act was discussed by our subcommittee on traffic enforcement. You can also see that our Arlington County Police Department went back and reviewed all their current practices. We did have a duty to intervene, but it had been mixed in with some of our other directives. So we created a separate standalone policy on our duty to intervene. And we reaffirmed the previous policies you can see there that ban chokeholds and strangleholds, required de-escalation, exhausting all possible avenues before a shooting could take place, and reinforced our comprehensive reporting and our use of force policies. So we can go on to the next slide. You can see there, and the board members played a critical role in this, which is that the board gave direction in the spring, and by December of last year, we implemented our body-worn camera program. And those cameras are used in recording all dispatch calls for service, enforcement, and investigations. and they complement the in-car cameras that had already been in place for a number of years. And so in January of this past year, 3 months ago, our chief of police signed on to something called the Northern Virginia Regional Critical Incident Response Team. And this team will help perform criminal investigations with certain critical incidents involving law enforcement. It's an independent investigation on serious uses of police force. And this memorandum of understanding, which our chief signed, was drafted in close consultation with the Commonwealth's attorney. You can see also the board accepted in December 2020 the Restorative Arlington Strategic Plan, which had been worked on out of my office, and that work continues. That lays out a roadmap for the introduction of restorative justice practices in county government, our schools, and our community. So we can go on. Just a reminder on the next slide, we have taken a number of steps in the area of mental health with funding from the board. We have introduced a Children's Regional Crisis Response Team. We've developed the Arlington Recovery Center. We have emergency service clinicians now deployed in our Emergency Communications Center. And you can see, I'm not going to read the rest, but you'll see there's a few other steps that we have taken. And the last one here, we're continuing to work with Virginia Hospital Center on expanding the number of psychiatric beds. One thing, actually, before we flip the slide, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, is that beginning next year, there will be implementation of a federal 988 hotline, which will be an emergency call number for people who find themselves in a mental health crisis. Let's go on to the next slide. So you'll see here that the subcommittees of the PPG began their work, and there, as I mentioned earlier, I think there were about 100 recommendations. So the focus of the first group, the Civilian Review Board, you can see here, was to not whether there would be a Civilian Review Board, but to identify potential models. And they spent a lot of time looking at the models, authority, composition, role, and training. And when looking at all those issues, the subcommittee looked at what role this board should play in relationship to the police department. So if we go on to the next slide, what it is with all the recommendations that they made, and they covered a range of items, where I have landed and where I will be coming forward to the board in May is proposing that the Civilian Review Board, consistent with the recommendations made by the PPG, be a hybrid model of civilian oversight that would include a paid position entitled an auditor-monitor. The Civilian Review Board proposed authority would include the ability to receive complaints, review investigations after they've been completed, advise on policies and procedures, issue public reports, and engage with the community. Still spending some time weighing where we might end up on their recommendation that the board have subpoena authority. I had included funding for hiring of the auditor monitor, and I'm proposing that that auditor monitor report to me, and that the county board appoint all the members of the Civilian Review Board, with hopefully a launch in the fall of this year, 2021. And so, as I mentioned, I will be bringing a draft ordinance to the board for the May meeting that will look at all those issues and those authorities that I've laid out. Not included in my recommendation were two suggestions by the Police Practices Group that the Civilian Review Board have independent authority to discipline members of the police department and contemporaneous authority to do independent investigations. So, and also it's my hope this evening that you'll adopt my recommendation to fund the auditor monitor position, for which I've included $125,000 in the budget. And you can see the timeline there I'm proposing for the Civilian Review Board. We would bring the request to advertise next month for adoption in June. The state authority to actually have these boards becomes effective July 1st. And then the board would, over the course of the summer, appoint the Civilian Review Board members. We would go through the process of recruiting and hiring an auditor monitor. And hopefully the board could get underway with its activities sometime in the fall of this year. Okay. So let's move on to the next subgroup on traffic enforcement. The traffic subcommittee's charge was to identify potential models for traffic enforcement that might be effective for Arlington County. Throughout their work, they knew that their work on traffic stops also encompassed driving and walking and biking and distracted and impaired individuals who might be driving, and also reckless driving. And the subcommittee agreed that safety is a top priority, and they focused on several key areas: understanding the reasons for traffic stops, understanding the demographics related to traffic stops, and also exploring alternative enforcement strategies, including engineering and technology solutions. You see, if we go to the next slide, there's a lot of information here. This encompasses all the recommendations that the traffic subcommittee made. Let me walk through some of them. I think the critical ones. For traffic data, they suggested there be a position set aside to do analysis of all the traffic data to discuss those trends that I mentioned earlier. And that position has already been created within the Department of Environmental Services, and that work has already begun. On the middle column there, which is traffic policy, technology, and safety, the fiscal 22 budget I proposed includes funding for unsworn officers for parking enforcement, traffic flow, and other related traffic activities. And I'm also committed to working with the board to advance a request to our legislative delegation to expand the use of red light and speed cameras as recommended by the subcommittee, and also a review of potential additional locations for camera placement. Also, I did want to mention next month I will be bringing the Vision Zero action plan to the county board. And this effort's been underway for quite a while, and it's been done in partnership with 25 county commissions, committees, and citizen advocacy groups. We've heard from over 1,600 residents. And we've already taken some of the initial steps to establish our street safety improvements. You'll see in the third column, which talks about equity and traffic enforcement, I'm also going to explore with the board about including in our legislative package the option to have traffic-related fees and fines vary based on the ability to pay, and looking at other approaches to fines and enforcement. You see, as I mentioned, these are the positions that I proposed in the budget. I'm hoping you will adopt this evening. I have my fingers crossed on that. And also for Vision Zero, the data analyst position that we've already included as an action on my part. Okay, so if we could go on to the next slide. The subcommittee on mental health and policing. The charge of that subcommittee was to review proactive treatment options, crisis intervention, long-term oversight, and review protocols for work with our police and our mental health experts, and to look at systemic change that would require working across agencies. We're going to focus our immediate actions on advancing some of the services that are listed here on this slide, which include preparing clinicians for co-response, starting a lot of work based on essentially the CAHOOTS model out in Oregon, which would bring a mobile crisis model, establish protocols in our emergency communications center, and maximize the use of alternative transport services for some of our people who are affected by mental health issues, and also use data and on after action reviews, and then also continue our planning over a several-year period for additional steps. Now, my proposed budget for fiscal 22 included proposed funding that came to over $500,000 to improve a number of specific activities. I'm not going to read through all of them here. I think the county board is familiar with most of them, all of them actually, and I'm hoping that you'll act this evening on adding the additional staff, a physician assistant, a psychiatric nurse, an emergency services clinician. And again, these are the first year of a 3-year implementation plan, a lot more to come. And then also the non-personnel funding that we've noted at the bottom of this slide. Now on to the final group, which is the group that looked at alternative disputes and alternative dispute resolution. This subcommittee was charged with identifying potential approaches in lieu of traditional policing. So alternative criminal justice strategies, including alternative dispute methods that I highlighted earlier, which include restorative justice and mediation. They took a look, this subcommittee spent a lot of time emphasizing what I think is really important here, which is the critical role of education and training to try to move away from the culture of calling 911. And, you know, for so many years as our community has been told, see something, say something. And that is an approach that we need to revisit and rethink and spend a lot of time working on different approaches to that. So let's go on to the next slide. There were some specific recommendations that this subcommittee had. The first one was to repeal a provision that is in the county code that makes it a criminal act to fail to produce identification if asked by a law enforcement officer. So this package of proposals I will bring to you for changes in the county code associated with the Civilian Review Board. I'm also going to include a proposal in that package that will propose repealing this provision of the county ordinance. We're also in the process of looking at other provisions in Title 17 of the county ordinance, and I will follow up with additional proposals on that in the future. We have funds set aside for additional call taker training and dispatch training in our emergency communications center. And I would say that the critical issue here, and one of the hardest ones, is how to have conversations with our community about the best way to deal with incidents in our community. And again, the predisposition for everyone to pick up the phone and call 911 in cases perhaps where an alternative might be better. And I also mentioned the hotline that's coming in July. So I ran through this really quickly because there's a lot of material here. You know, the work we're doing here is incredibly important, and it really complements what we have in our high quality police force. I think the work of the PPG was really compelling. They spent a lot of time and a lot of energy working on all these issues and to promote transparency and accountability. And I really want to thank each and every member of the 15 members of the police practices group, which included a wide swath of representation of our community and also 3 members of our police department. So I feel like I haven't caught my breath. I will stop there, Mr. Chair, and I'm happy to take any questions on any of that material that I covered. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz, for reviewing those slides and the statements forward on implementation. I'm getting a little bit of feedback, so if folks who are on, if you could put yourself on mute, that'd be great. Thank you. What I propose to colleagues is just to go around and have brief comments. For me, I'll just lift up a couple. I don't know if you said, Mr. Schwartz, will we be posting that presentation you just did on our police practice group webpage or the home, whatever's the appropriate part of our website?
Yes, I will. And there is, I'm glad you mentioned, there is a separate webpage set up with the recommendations and the full report, which comes to somewhere over 90 pages, which I commend to people to read. It has an extensive bibliography for each of the subcommittees, which could take many hours of your day and week, and I commend it to people.
Great, thanks. I guess the only other thing I'd like to note, and then I do have one question, is that we're starting this process. You had a slide that mentioned in May we'll be considering steps forward, and so for me, and I think it's just, and for us as a community, I think implementing the recommendations is where the rubber hits the road, where our community can get more safe, and so that everyone is feeling safe and is safe in our community. We have had and do have a very safe community. We have steps yet to go further. So the only question I would have, just looking through the report, the 80+ 90+ page report is traffic enforcement. There was a piece there that talked about safety, and it's my impression that at this stage, the 6 positions that you're recommending would not be, they wouldn't be doing traffic stops at this stage, but that seems, from what I can understand, to be not ruled out in multiple years down the road, but not at this stage. Do I have that right?
And so the positions that are included in the proposed budget are not sworn officers. In other words, they will not be carrying firearms with them. And I think that this is, it's an interesting policy area. There's an intersection, no pun intended, on traffic enforcement between whether you need armed enforcement or whether you could do some of that work without armed enforcement. Really some of the most difficult situations that arise are during traffic stops, and people who, there's a history in the United States of using traffic stops on some occasions, stopping people on a pretextual basis and using that as a way to carry out some unfortunate steps that law enforcement we've seen in other jurisdictions. And I think that there's a lot more work to be done in the country and also in this area and also in Arlington to figure out what's the right balance. We need to have police who are able to interdict cars who are doing really horrible things. But at the same time, there are a number of traffic infractions that could be handled in other ways, whether through traffic cameras. And this additional staff we're adding will be able to, note to people what's the best way to approach how to handle themselves, much more focused on the Vision Zero approaches for people who are using scooters, bicycles, and the intersection, again, of how those people interact with vehicles. So a lot more work to be done in that area. We often hear from our community that we aren't doing enough when it comes to traffic enforcement. And I don't view this as necessarily meaning that we need to write more tickets or arrest more people. I think we need to do more education and work with our community to engage in safe practices.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schwartz. Those are the only questions I had, and that helps. There is a lot of detail and a lot of, it's not an easy area, and we want safety to be the result for everyone. And so I'll stop there. Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Schwartz, thank you so much for this report. And I believe that you deserve all the credit for having diligently convened the group when the board decided that this was necessary. And I believe that the way the group, the work was done is in many ways very revealing, very exemplary. We see these. I had a lot of. I got a lot to think when I read through this almost 90 pages. So I have 2 questions though for now, so that I frame my mind for what comes next, and is the discussion about implementation and adoption of these recommendations. You said about the Civilian Review Board, which I believe is a key element of restoring framing, establishing trust between police and our community, and creating this good accountability nexus between the two. You said that you don't recommend that the Civilian Review Board should have the authority to discipline. And the second thing that you said is that you don't recommend that the Civilian Review Board should have the authority to investigate by its own motion, so to say, by its own right. But does this mean that, for example, only issues that what would trigger a Civilian Review Board's review if the review board doesn't have its own, cannot trigger it by its own initiative?
So thank you for that question, Mr. Karantonis. There is nothing that is out of bounds from the Civilian Review Board to look at. The question is, when it comes to investigations, given that there are timelines to meet and we have a series of professional investigators within the police department, and we're doing a separate body of work that looks at how those assessments have been done internally, that the Civilian Review Board would have an ability to look at the record that was created during an investigation, review the questions and answers, which are all recorded, and then ask additional follow-up questions after the investigation had gone from beginning to end, and then pose those questions and have additional follow-up done. So just so people understand, there would not be a contemporaneous investigation. There are some Civilian Review Board models where there's a complaint that comes in and that Civilian Review Board goes ahead and creates its own cadre of investigators and then goes ahead and does an investigation. I didn't think that was necessary. It wasn't borne out by the information. I'm never going to foreclose that as a potential future option. I just don't think that that's where we should start. So that was on that. On discipline, I think, again, the Civilian Review Board may want to offer its thoughts about whether a disciplinary action by the police chief was the right one or the wrong one, but the final authority rests with the police chief. And I think that I would expect the board to look at more patterns and approaches to discipline. You know, at the end of the day, it's a very difficult thing for me to support to have outside group of people involved in disciplining county employees. And, you know, I'm going to feel that same way when it comes to collective bargaining too, but I feel like that is one of the primary responsibilities you've placed on me as county manager, and I place on my department heads to be very vigorous about that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Schwartz. Just to round it up, you mentioned police chief. How is that all the reporting right now informing the search, the ongoing search for the replacement of our police chief?
Yeah, so I'll speak to that in a little bit, but I will tell you that it's my firm expectation. I have made it clear to anyone who's interviewed for the position that they will follow at least all the recommendations I support in the police practices group, and there he or she is free to challenge me on those ones that I did not recommend. So, you know, I expect whoever the next police chief is will be walking around with this with a tired and tattered copy of this document in his or her front pocket.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Schwartz.
Thank
and
you,
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Karantonis and Mr. Schwartz. I believe it's Ms. Crystal next.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Manager, thank you for this extensive presentation, for convening the group, for engaging with them in formal and informal ways throughout their analysis. My particular thanks to the group, to the leaders who authored this document, who engaged in the extensive conversations. It's hard to believe that a 90-page document is only the tip of an iceberg, but it really is. You know, I am really struck, with the exception of the Civilian Review Board, and let me say I'm really looking forward to some what I think will be difficult but important conversations about that over the next month as we follow the timeline the manager outlined. With the exception of the Civilian Review Board, I am really struck that all of the subcommittees and all of the recommendations came up with something that, at least in my estimation, is actually not about police practices at all. It's about practices to create alternatives to police. And I think that is exactly the right place our community should be headed. I think we have heard from so many members of our community that this is a priority for them, that there be somewhere that they can turn when a loved one is in mental health crisis, that there be someone who can keep them safe as a pedestrian or cyclist who is not armed. And I think this is importantly something we've not only heard from members of our community, but from so many members of our police department as well. This really is an area in terms of the need for alternatives to policing, where those who are skeptical of police and those who serve in uniform have common ground, I believe, which is that police and the use of police power should be reserved for incidents where public safety is under its greatest threat, and that we should be, as a community, finding more appropriate ways to deal with the many things police are often called upon to do. And again, I cannot commend the police practices group highly enough for really drilling down to say, what are the structures, the positions, the practices, the budget priorities, the policy changes that we need to fund, implement, create, pursue, and be accountable for in order to create alternative practices to police. So to that end, the only comment I have, we still have extensive work ahead to implement. I think the headline from our manager's report today, at least as I understand it, is that nearly every one of these recommendations will be implemented in some form or fashion. The challenge, because these are so cross-cutting, is how do we track it, and how do members of our community who are interested in following that work know that county government is doing so. As you talked, Mr. Manager, I counted. I'm just looking at all of the places an interested resident would have to be able to follow. They'd need to be able to follow our Vision Zero plans. They'd need to follow our county budget, including at least the DES budget, the DHS budget, the ACPD budget, the Department of Public Safety, Communications, and Emergency Management budget, our legislative package, a forthcoming standalone ordinance on a civilian review board, Title 17 of the county ordinance, practices and administrative policies within ACPD, Emergency Communication Center, and others. So I think we're going to have a real challenge in how we communicate our progress. I hope the analogy doesn't make anyone involved in this feel demeaned. It's another equally important but very different body of work. But I would point to at year one of the child care initiative, our team produced a great summary document that highlighted the ordinance changes that have been passed, the practices that have been passed, the work within DES or DHS, and some of the private sector work that it advanced to. And so I think that was a great model of a very high level summary of how a group that similarly, again, very different topic, but similarly made a whole bunch of cross-cutting recommendations across sectors, departments, policy mechanisms. And I think we could maybe learn a lot from that about how we do some high level annual reporting on how this work is all going. Again, thank you to you, Mr. Manager, for the time that you've spent committed to this, and a particular thanks to our residents and especially the leadership of ACPD who participated in the police practices work group.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Schwartz. This work often doesn't begin in any real meaningful or earnest way absent a crisis that a community has experienced. And I would like to stand up that Arlington, looked at the national issues and conversation and did the really tough work of saying, we're not going to allow this to happen to us before we begin this important and meaningful engagement. And I think this is really a great body of work to start. There's going to be so much more to be said and to do later. I'll just highlight a couple of things that I feel strongly about and I'm really proud that we're moving forward with. One, the repeal of the failure to ID provision. I think that's just really great work and emblematic of exactly the kind of structural issues that we're looking to overcome, not just within the police department, but within local government overall. Something that is on the books maybe for a different generational period in time that may have made sense then, but no longer makes sense, but can be used as a harsh cudgel in order to put people into a criminally involved situation. The fact we're not going to wait until we get multiple consultants to tell us various perspectives on it. We've identified that it's wrong, and you're looking forward to repealing it. I just like to stand that up as exactly the type of thing that we need to overcome so many structural issues that we see in communities. Next, just a question, because my understanding that also along with this work, you contracted with a consultant to really do a deep dive into internal policies in the police department to align them with known best practices in the industry. And I'd just like to hear a little bit more as to when you expect that output to circulate and what we can look forward to in terms of maybe some new thoughts on training that may be made available for our officers and law enforcement community.
So thank you, Mr. Dorsey. So we have contracted with Hilliard Hines as an outside consultant to look at 6 areas. Those included reviewing our use of force policies to see how they compared with best practice policies, our training and supervision policies, our body-worn camera policies, how we do our recruitment and retention, and also our policies around internal affairs and collecting data. Much to my regret, that report, which I had hoped would have been to us sometime in the fall or early winter, has not arrived. There has been a lot of conversation that I have been able to participate in, but no final report. I can only state this, which is, and I'm beyond eager is the way I will put it for a final report, that there isn't anything that I have heard yet from our consultants that lead me to believe that we can't make adjustments and changes that are consistent with everything that the police practices group talked about. I would be to you I would have been to you a long time ago to say that at least the preliminary analysis had found anything that showed that we were far off not only the average, but we're still among the very best. But there still is, and I await the final version of that report, some work that can be learned from all of that. And I would note that we've also contracted with the same outside consultant to also look beyond policies and to actually, I know the board is going to take up later today a consideration about whether this organization should have access to all our internal affairs files so they can actually do a factual specific analysis. So we're going to do that. So that's an update on that. I think it's unfortunate that I didn't have that final report for you because, as you know, when you don't have information, nature abhors a vacuum and people wonder what the delay was, but I can assure you that there's nothing of substance behind that.
Well, look, whenever it comes, it will be useful and we will incorporate it appropriately. So I wouldn't get too bent out of shape about the timing, frustrating though it may be. But I've also been struck, and I think that that's an important body of work, but as an avid watcher of the proceedings in Minneapolis and the Chauvin trial, I will note that even clearly articulated and well-constructed policies in accordance with best practice don't prevent bad outcomes from occurring. So another thing that I would like to point out is that our, standing up the failure to intervene as a standalone policy, and hopefully there will be robust and ongoing training and reminders of that very critical duty for law enforcement. That to me is how, we make sure to the best extent we can, we protect against the actions of one rogue individual, as it were, is by having a culture of people who understand their broader duties when it comes to intervening when they see something go wrong. So I'll stop pontificating there and just say that I look forward to the rest of this work. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Ms. Garvey.
Oh, thank you very much. So I'll try. This is an exciting time to be at. I don't want to go on too long, but I will say I kind of came of age when those failure to ID laws were put into place. I remember that time. I've seen us as a nation try to sort of address equity issues and not really do a little bit and then fall back. And I am really optimistic about where we are. This is just such an exciting time right now for me anyway, having watched what I have in my lifetime. A couple of thoughts. I am struck by a number of the issues that our managers laid out are things that we actually had already done foundations for. So body-worn cameras, we'd already done the research for it. We were actually thinking of moving forward with it so that when that became clear something we needed to do, it was ready to go. Traffic enforcement, as I recollect, that budget that became irrelevant last year actually had some traffic enforcement that were not going to be uniform. So we were moving in that direction. On mental health, we've had crisis intervention teams, which have done so much, but we need to do a lot more. But that foundation has been laid a little bit, a concept about how you should handle mental health. Alternative disputes, Mr. Dorsey, when he was our chair, started our whole equity work, and the manager put in place the restorative justice work we've done so that when that came forward, we had a foundation there too. So I've really been struck by, in many ways, what a good position this community is in as having a foundation to build in on all of these, and how much work there is still to do. We were probably at times getting a little in danger of thinking, well, we're really good because we do this and this and this, and then not examining like we need to. And obviously the events of the summer of 2020 really made us all realize how much work needs to be done, and started examining things and finding so much. So really appreciate the work of the police practices group. That was an incredibly long effort, and a lot more to go, but they have also provided a really good foundation. And then my final thought is that I have noticed, even when I was on the school board, how often when you focus at trying to work on equity and make something better for a certain group of people, education maybe for our students with learning disabilities, equity issues for our students of color that weren't doing as well. When you do that and look at it, though, usually almost everything you do makes it better for everyone. And I think that's the case here. I think the better enforcement on traffic enforcement, hopefully we'll get more cameras that don't, there's no kind of bias or anything in there. I think that will help. The education that we need to do on alternative disputes, and education to get people to stop using 911 at times and think about what they're doing, all of that will benefit the entire community and make it better for everybody. So this is a really exciting time. Just want to say thank you to everybody. Lots more work to do, but an incredibly good foundation. And I'm really, really pleased at where we are now and proud of what we've done, despite the fact that there's a lot more to go. But I'm excited. Thank you.